I was already nervous about how I was gonna do, and then yeah, it's like great. You get the city champion in round one. That's cool. It was a pretty competitive game, and let me see. Let's go ahead and just get right into it, I guess. So he played the ready knight f3, which played d5, g3, knight f6, pretty standard stuff. Bishop g2, and I played bishop f5, which Jared pointed out to me after the fact is not the main line. I guess it's bishop g4, with a lot of the same ideas that were played in the game, but with the bishop on g4. And he kind of explained to me, and you'll see here in a few moves where with bishop f5, it's very easy for white to exchange that bishop off if he wants to with knight h4. With a bishop on g4, he actually has to work a little bit harder to do that. He has to play h3, bishop h5, g4, bishop g6, knight h4. So it's easy for white to get the bishop pair if he wants it when you put the bishop on f5. Not that that's some kind of crushing advantage, but it's just a subtlety to be aware of, I guess. But in any case, I played bishop f5. He played d3. I played knight b d7. I kind of wanted to keep my options open as far as pawn moves go. I thought I might possibly play c5. I might even play e5, depending on how things go. So I don't know. I figured knight b d7 was just flexible, I guess. So he goes ahead and plays this knight h4 idea. Bishop g6, knight takes g6, h takes g6, and c4. So a lot of times in these sorts of hyper modern opening setups, you'll see this where white won't occupy the center with pawns necessarily, but he'll have these three pawns, e2, d3, c4, kind of attacking or controlling squares along this diagonal to support this bishop on g2. So with c4, he's wanting to kind of challenge this d5 pawn that is sort of blocking the way of this bishop. So I played c6 to kind of reinforce that. And he goes ahead and exchanges because the pawns on d5 and c6 basically shut down that bishop. So getting to exchange that c pawn is, a little bit beneficial for white. So he now plays queen b3, and he's forking the d5 pawn and the b7 pawn. So I have to do something about that because I only have one defender of the d5 pawn, the knight on f6, and nothing's defending b7. So what I did here was I played queen c7, which defends this b7 pawn and also attacks this bishop on c1. So he has to do something about the bishop on c1, and when he does that, I have time to play e6 to defend the d5 pawn, which is exactly what happened. He played knight c3, and I played e6. And here, now that I've committed to e6, he plays bishop f4. There are a couple of opportunities for him a few moves ago to play bishop f4, but I have e5, just pawn to e5, that occupies the center with tempo. Now that I've played e6, it's harder for me to do that, and also the d5 pawn is attacked several times, so it's questionable whether I could even do that in this position or not. I decided to play queen b6. I'm okay with this queen trade. The position, I think, is fine. If he plays queen takes b6 and I play knight takes b6, we reach a position where I don't think that white is significantly better. I think he might have a slight edge because of the bishop pair. And my knight on b6 is a little bit misplaced. It's not really doing much on b6. So I'd want to reroute that at some point. But I don't think it's really super advantageous for white. I was okay with going into this position. Not what happened, though. He simply castled. And I was actually pretty happy to see this move. Because now I can make this queen trade, and he's got these double isolated pawns on b2 and c3. Sorry, b2 and b3. And while that's not necessarily a huge problem for him right now, I felt like down the road that would be an important imbalance for me. It's at least something that at some point in the future of the game I can latch on to try to gain an edge. And I think that that's something that's very important. It's kind of an important concept to understand, is that sometimes in a game you might create an imbalance, not necessarily because it's immediately winning for you or it has some kind of, you might not necessarily be better right away, but if you create the imbalance, it might give you something to work with later. Something that if your opponent, plays suboptimally, you can take advantage of. And especially at this rating level, we're all going to play suboptimally. So it'll give you chances later in the game. So these doubled pawns might not necessarily be a huge issue right now, but I was very happy with making this queen trade because I felt like these pawns could give me winning chances later. So now I played bishop c5, and I was debating where to put the bishop, but I think that this is a good place for it. It covers a7, and one thing that I do have to be aware of is he, on the previous move, is he might put his knight on b5 and attack this c7 square. And if I do nothing, it's a little bit hard to deal with that. And he'll be hitting the a7 pawn as well, but primarily this c7 square. He'll be threatening to fourth my king and my king and my rook. And I don't have a lot of good ways to deal with that. But after bishop c5, if he were to play knight b5 on this move, I can now castle. And if he plays knight c7, especially now with my bishop on c5, defending this a7 pawn, I don't really have a whole lot to worry about. I can just move out of the way with like rook c8. So that's why bishop c5. Here he played e4, and the computer is actually pretty okay with this move, but from a practical standpoint, I was pretty happy to see this because one of the bigger imbalances that I think favors him in this position is the bishop pair. And it would be, like I said, at least practically an edge or a good thing for me to close up the position because I have two knights. If I can shut down the position and make his bishops not very useful, my knights will be able to get around and hit some of his weak spots. And I think that would be good for me. So he plays e4, and this gives me the opportunity to play e5, getting a tempo on this bishop on f4, and also blocking this e4 pawn, so you can't advance it. And this e4 pawn, if left alone, will kind of shut down his bishop on g2. So I gain a tempo with e5. He plays bishop g5, and I then play d4 to just close up the position. And I was pretty happy at this point. And he plays this move knight e2, and we agreed in the analysis afterward that I think this is probably one of his biggest mistakes in the game. I think this is where the position really, it goes from slightly advantageous for me to I'm feeling very good, because the knight on e2 is not really accomplishing much. He might try to push with like f4 and break on the king side, but I feel like my position is solid enough. There's no queens on the board. I don't think that the f4 push is very dangerous for me. So his knight on e2 I feel like is not doing that well. And I play bishop b4, and this is interesting because there's two purposes to this move. And part of it actually goes back to when he played bishop g5. The reason why I played bishop b4 is because I want to free up that square for my knight to come in and hit these d3 and b3 pawns, which are very, very hard for him to defend, and he would have to bring his knight back to c1 in order to do that. But the thing about bringing his knight back to c1 is that it takes away a square for his bishop on g5, and you'll notice that his bishop on g5 is running out of squares, because it can't come to f4, it can't come to e3, obviously it can't go to h6. If it ever goes to h4, for example, if I ever get in knight h7 and he were to come back to h4, then I would push with g5 and the bishop is trapped, which is kind of a good pattern to know. If you're going to fianchetto your bishop on g2 with the pawn on g3, you have to be watchful about a bishop on g5, because it's easier to trap when it doesn't have the g3 square to retreat to. So the idea of bishop b4 is to take away one more square for his bishop, and then after I attack his pawns with knight c5, and if he ever wanted to retreat knight to c1 to protect those pawns, I might be able to get in knight h7, after which his bishop has no squares. So that's kind of the point of bishop b4. And he plays this move rook a4, which doesn't really accomplish a whole lot. And I was very happy to see this move as well, because I can simply play a5. My bishop is rock solid on b4, and his rook on a4 kind of is just on a less than ideal square, because now really if it ever wants to go anywhere, it would have to come back to a1 and, you know, reroute to like c1 or something along those lines. He played rook f to c1, or just rook c1. His other rook is on a4 now. So he played rook c1, and here I just played knight h7. And now you'll kind of notice that, yeah, his bishop is out of squares here. And his idea with this was to sack the exchange. He played rook takes b4 to free up d2. I play a takes b4, and he plays bishop back to d2. So he's giving up an exchange for a pawn, trying to kind of free up the game a little bit. And here, finally, on move 20, I castle. There's not any way for me to protect this b4 pawn, so I just end up having to let it go. But before he takes it, I want to make sure that I castle so that he's not hitting the f8 square with his bishop. I need to get my rook out and into the game before that happens. So then he plays this move bishop h3. So he's hitting the knight on d7. He's kind of getting his bishop out of the hole that it's in on g2, because now the bishop that used to be pretty good is just completely blocked in by this e4 pawn, and there's really no way to, undo that. So he plays bishop h3 to give it some life. Put my knight back onto f6 to protect it and get that knight back into the game. He plays rook c7. So he's hitting the pawn on b7 and the knight on d7. But what I looked at here is that I can play rook f to c8. Because these two pieces back here, the knight and the bishop, are unprotected and they can't protect each other. So if he moves the rook away from the c file, I'll put my rook on c2 and skewer those pieces. So he can take the knight on d7 if he wants to, but then I'll get my rook onto c2. I'll be hitting both of those pieces. I'll have a rook on the 7th. I might be able to get that b2 pawn and the b3 pawn thereafter. And that is basically what happened. He played rook takes b7, and I played rook c2. And he takes this pawn on b4. I take his knight. He takes my knight. I take back. We exchange. And then I play rook takes b. Oh, did my Skype freeze up?
Yeah. You got rook takes b2 was the last thing you said.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. So, so basically I played rook takes b2, and this position should be pretty clearly winning. I'm going to get that b3 pawn. The d3 pawn is going to fall shortly thereafter. He plays bishop d6, attacking e5, and I just play f6. He plays b4, and then I play rook a to a2. And with this move, I should have time to... I'm going to win either his f2 pawn or his h2 pawn, and then I have lots of checkmating threats on the back rank. I'll be able to win his d3 pawn, create this protected passed d pawn, and this b4 pawn is not going to be able to get anywhere. My rooks are active enough that I can cover that and make threats of my own. And after rook a2, he resigned.
Hello?
Hey, Zach.
Hey.
Let's see if your audio or video pops up.
Oh, I need to turn it on. Is it working?
Yeah, there we go.
Okay, sweet.
All right. Well, what did you think of the tournament this weekend? Last weekend?
I liked it. Obviously, I'd say that, but it was, smaller attendance, but the competition was real good.
Yeah.
Just average rating was a lot higher than normal. I feel good competition. I think this was the only round where I played someone lower rated than me, but he did not play. He played like an 1800 plus player. So, yeah. Okay, you ready to start going over the moves?
Yep, ready.
Yeah, I play the ready. So I played knight f3, g3, and he led with d5, knight f6. Yeah, so this is just going to be pretty normal first few moves. e6, d4, bishop e7, castle, castle. Really, I think the craziest part about this game is definitely going to be towards the end game where it got really close, I feel. c3, bd7, bishop g5, e6. Okay, so this is... I'm a little bit behind on my opening studying, honestly. It's been a while since I've gone over my openings and, prepared them. I'm a little behind in practice, but this already caught me off guard kind of immediately. Obviously, I know what he wants to do. He wants to get his bishop out, but it just makes me wonder if there's some sort of advantage I can take over here on the queen side, just because that pawn structure is not looking amazing. I think obviously he can push to c5 next turn, but still, I think I want to make some headway over here on the queen side after this. Yeah, I just want to get that file open, even though it's going to open him up a little bit too. C takes d5, C takes d5, rook c1, getting that rook over to the file, bishop a6, and I figured he'd do that because that's the best spot for the bishop. Queen a4. Just want to try to get my queen active, do it, get a free move because I'm attacking it. Bishop e7, e3. I just didn't want to worry about guarding the pawn again because I want to try to do something with my knight. And if ever he wanted to attack e3 again, attack e2 again, I want to have it off that square. I also want to cover d4, a6. Going to try to get my queen out of there, so I just beat him to the punch. Queen b3. Played b5. Okay, bishop 6. I finally took f6, and this is something I'll normally do in my opening. I'm pretty sure it's what you're supposed to do, but just because that dark squared bishop for me isn't really, it's going to be hard for me to use it otherwise because it's the bad bishop, and if I try to go put it on f4, he can immediately remove it by putting his knight on h5, and he's going to get it anyways. So I usually ended up taking the knight on f6 just because it's kind of a more closed position. You know, I'll give him the bad bishop for the knight. He takes f6. e3. Rook c8. Knight a2. Yeah, I'm not sure about that one either. Knight a2. I think it was probably a fine move, but it is. I just want to try to activate the knight, put it on a2 first so I can get it somewhere like b4. Yeah, but right now it doesn't look very good, and it might get stuck there. I'm not sure about that. Knight e4. Also, I give him e4, which good square for his knight. I'll take on c8 because I can put my other rook back on c1 if he decides to take with the queen, which I'm pretty sure he does. Queen takes. Look over in c1, so I get the file. Queen b8. Knight e5. Rook c8, so he's trying to contest the file. And this is a move I thought a lot about. And I'm trying to remember my exact thought process here. But I ended up taking the knight on e4. And I'm not sure how good that move is. Because obviously I think my bishop is pretty good. It's considered the good bishop right here, considering all my pawns are in dark colored squares. But I don't know. That knight was just kind of really annoying to me. And I just wanted to get rid of it with the bishop. So I went ahead and took. That definitely makes things tricky for my knight, however, as we're about to see. I can't retreat it back to d3 or f3. So I'm going to have to do some fancy footwork with the knight to actually get it back to safety if he starts attacking it. And it got kind of hairy there for a second, and it will here in a few moves. But yeah, so bishop takes e4. No, sorry, he didn't. Bishop takes e4. He took c1 first. And I took. Then he took. Just trading the rooks. And now my knight in c1, they can't even go to d3 right now. So it's going to take a little bit of effort on my part to get those knights working again. But overall, I guess my goal here is he's got the bishop's pair, I got the knight's pair. I want to try to keep the position as close as possible. So that's what I'm going to try to be doing moving forward. Otherwise, his bishops will just destroy me. I understand now. I was confused because of my... Okay. Yeah, I played h4. That's right. Okay. This I'm not sure about this move either, obviously, because I was looking at it like, did I really play h4? I remember my reasoning now. I wanted to... If things went bad, I wanted to get my knight back on h2, kind of as an escape route, just because he's going to end up attacking it. Right now, it doesn't have many safe squares. Like if I...
Oh, okay.
If he attacks on h6... I'd have to retreat back to g4. But then from g4, if I didn't play h2, so if he did something like, I don't know. Oh, can I not move? Okay, let's just say I did something. Let's say I did play knight e2. He played, I don't know. Let's say attack it with the bishop. No? I guess it's fine here.
Yeah, knight a2, the computer went down to -3 from close to even. So
yeah, he can just attack it, I assume. Oh, but the computer didn't like that one either. What's the move, computer? But anyways, my line of reasoning was from there, I don't really have any spots to go. So if he were to attack it, I'd have to just put it back on e5 and just lose the pawn. Once he takes, he takes. So I played h4 to give it a spot. I don't think this is an option either. Because he can just come in there. Same situation, except now I've activated his queen as well. Where I have to go back because I don't have any spots. So I think I played h4. Well, I know I played h4, so I could have that spot just in case. Because that's kind of what I need to worry about right now is this knight. It's on a good spot now, but can be easily removed and easily trapped. So it looks like computer likes h4 more than knight a2, so I'll take it. Okay, queen c7. So now he's covering the d7 square as well. He's on the file, so now, yeah, his queen's looking pretty good. Queen c7. Knight e2. Here's where I played knight e2. Yeah, I'm planning to put my queen on c3, and e2 is just a little bit better than a2 right now, I think. e2. Bishop d6. He's attacking that knight, so I got to do something. Queen c3. So that just makes sure when he takes, I take. He can't take the pawn back. So that's exactly what happened. Even though it doesn't really look like that pawn structure's ideal right now, like that e5 pawn looks pretty vulnerable. I believe later in the game, it proves to be kind of challenging to take on his part. Like, especially when his only piece outside of his pawns and his king is a light squared bishop, it's going to be really hard for him to attack that, because there's not really any good way for his king to get in there either, especially if I put my knight in the game. So I don't think the e5 pawn really is that big of a deal. So that's why I was kind of fine with just doubling up my pawns like that. And it looks like he took my queen trade. Knight takes c3. King f8. So now we just need to get our kings in the game, because if we didn't, we really wouldn't have any much to do. King e7. 92. Okay. F6. Yeah, he just realized that otherwise that pawn's actually kind of in his way, so he kind of just has to trade them off like that. So f6. I think I took. He takes f6. King d2. King d6. Getting our kings in. Knight e2. I just want to give a spot to my king to get in there a little bit further. Give my knight maybe the square on f4. Because right from c3, I don't really think my knight could have done much. So try to get my king in there instead. Knight e2. e5. Now, I'm not sure if that was the best move for him. I don't know what he would have done instead. Obviously, he wants to just stop me from moving to d4 or f4, but I also think that's a pawn structure that I can easily take advantage of with the knight, especially because f6 and e5 aren't on light-colored squares, and that means his bishop can't even protect them, but my knight, I have a knight, so I can really attack them. That's what I did later on. I'm not too sure about e5 on his part. King c3. Let me get my king in there. King c5. Stopping me from going a little bit further in. I played g4. So I can give my knight that spot right there on g3. So I can try and attack. Can I like highlight squares? Yeah. Can you see that on your end?
Yeah.
Highlight it? Okay. Because I realized I've been using my mouse this whole time to point to stuff. I'm like, oh, wait.
Oh, yeah.
Can't see my screen. Okay. So yeah. I just want to put my knight on g3 there. Maybe put it on h5 afterward just so I can attack that pawn. Or even f5 is a pretty good spot for the knight. But yeah, I want to start trying to take advantage of those pawns over there. So I want to get my knight on the king side. So g4, a5. Just stopping me from he doesn't want me to move to b4 when his king moves away to go protect the pawns, I think. Knight g3, like I said. I'm just going to get in there. b4 check. Pawn trade, but oh geez, the computer really did not like that one. And I think it's because there's no way he can keep that pawn really and keep these pawns over here anymore, because the only way he can defend the b4 pawn is with the king, and because those other pawns on like f6 it's on a dark colored square now too. His bishop can't protect really that or that, so he's got to do it with the king, and he can't do both at the same time if I'm attacking f6 with the knight, b4 with the king. Probably why the computer wasn't a fan of that move. And I didn't even really think of that being a terrible move during the game, but now that I think about it, that kind of ended up biting him in the butt. So king c2. I didn't want to put it on b3 because I didn't want to get checked and then he could push it maybe. Just didn't want to worry about the light squared bishop. Bishop c8. He's going to do his best to get his bishop over there attacking the king side, maybe stopping me from taking those pawns or attacking my pawns. Bishop c8, g5. Just got to avoid his bishop somehow. f5. I skipped a move. I want to go back a few because I definitely skipped a move. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay.
Like I said, I'm not very good at this. Okay, a takes b4, a takes b4. I played king b3 here. That makes a lot more sense. Okay. Yeah, earlier I said I didn't move. I didn't want to move to b3 because I was worried about the bishop coming in and removing my king from that square anyways. And the move I missed was after king c2. He plays king d5, I think, just so he can more easily get to the king side there and guard his pawns. And now I don't have to worry about that bishop check anymore. So I went ahead and moved king b3 anyways. And that's the move I missed. Okay. So my king's on b3. Now I really am attacking his pawn. And, it's going to be hard to hold both of those there. So king b3. Then he played bishop c8. Played g5. Played f5. And then I took b4. Yeah, so now I got that passed pawn. It's going to be hard for him to worry about this one and worry about everything going on the king side. F4. I definitely don't want to take here because that will give him, double. I mean, I'll undouble his pawns. It'll be easier for him to maybe promote or something. So I just thought the best course of action was just to leave my pawns where they are. It's going to be hard for him to, take my pawns here. How do I get rid of that? If I let him take me, so if he takes like this, or he pushes, his pawns are just going to be stuck on my pawn or pawns anyways. So I figured I let him take me instead of the other way around, just to stop his pawns from moving forward. Let's see, f4. So I just move my knight. King e6. Going up there to guard. E takes. Oh, did I actually take? Oh yeah, because I'm attacking it twice. Duh. E takes. E takes. Got the pawn out of it. King f5. Now this is getting. I am up 2 pawns here, but it's not. I don't think I'm winning by that much, just because it's becoming very kind of draw-like territory almost. Whereas if he's able to get a few more, be able to take one of my pawns, this could easily be a draw because we almost have an even amount of pawns. We could. It gets kind of weird later. It's king f5. Knight d5. Just threatening the fork there. I know it's not going to last, but also stops him just from going in to like g6. Can still fork him right there. This g6. Force him to take the back route there. G4. Hit him with check anyways, just so I can take one of those pawns. King f3. He played king f3. So it looks like he's prioritizing the pawn that would allow him to promote. But I don't know. I think taking would have been better. Let's see what the computer thinks, because I think taking would have been better. It seems to agree that it would have been slightly better, just a little bit. Yeah, I think going for the f2 pawn seems strange, because I will be able to get that e4 pawn pretty easily, I think. So I don't think he really should have been prioritizing that pawn that much when I can take e4 in the end anyways. But he goes king f3. Nope. I checked. Then he goes king f3. King c5. Just wanted to get my king in there in case I had to take the e4 square. Yeah, the e4 square, and I want to be able to promote my pawn, so I got my king out of the way. King c5. King takes f2. Yeah, so it's especially strange to me that he went for that pawn and didn't even make an effort to guard e4 when he could have easily just taken my h4 pawn. Anyways, I'm going to take that. King f3. So going back in. Knight f6. I'm going to retreat back. Bishop to f3. That's not. No, bishop f5. Okay. Discarding the pawn. h5. Just wanted to have my pawn on a square that my knight could guard it. And maybe I'd be threatening to promote my own pawn here. h5, king f4. Knight takes h7. And he can't take my knight here. Although I think that was a mistake on my part anyways. Maybe. Because he can't take my knight here. Because I would push g6 and I'd be able to promote a pawn for sure. Because he has no way, out of this. It'd be like something like that. Get the bishop or get a queen too. And I was thinking that I'm like, oh, I take this pawn. You can't take. I basically am guaranteed a queen here. That wasn't necessarily the case because he's going to end up getting one of these pawns anyway by just ignoring that, which I didn't. I should have considered, but I really didn't. I just saw that, oh, he takes, I would get the queen. If he doesn't, then I promote. But he really can get one of these pawns. So it makes things kind of strange. It's king g4, f6 check. Yeah, I can't guard both of those pawns safely. If I do something like that, then he really does get the knight. So that would be not great. So let's see. Nope. King g4. I don't want my knight to be trapped over there at all or anything. I want it to be useful, so I'm going to put it back on f6. Protect the h5 one. King takes g5. Okay. I play knight d5. Okay. Yeah, this is where the game got really interesting because he only has the bishop. He can't win, so I'm playing for the win. He's playing for the draw here. But I feel like it's pretty close to a draw. All he has to do is win a pawn or sack his bishop for my two pawns, and it's a draw, and he gets his best outcome he can. And he could already take one right now if he wanted to. And he's got a bishop, so that means he could easily cover both pawns on both sides of the board. So it's really tricky here. I'm going to have to use my knight to stop his bishop in a lot of ways. And it's not easy. Bishop d7. Did I miss a move? I feel like I missed a move. I guess not. Bishop d7. h4. What? Oh, b4. b4. Got it. Bishop a4. Oh yeah, he wanted to get his bishop in there before my pawn got too far. And my pawn on h5 is not going anywhere, so he wasn't worrying about it. Bishop a4. Played knight f4.
Does knight b6 not work?
Knight d6.
Oh, it just goes up to e8 or something?
Yeah, that's what I was...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was worried about. He just goes back to e8. And I guess maybe would d6 work? Yeah, d6 wouldn't work. Yeah, so yeah, I don't think knight b6 would have worked. I think it would have just gone and been the same exact situation. But I played knight f4, which can't take. Otherwise, I'll just get to the end there. So I play knight f4. He plays f6. So once again, he just kind of ignores that knight sack there. I play b5. And I don't know if that was a mistake. I think that works. I second guessed myself at some point during the game after I played that. I thought maybe there was a way he could get my pawns here, but computer doesn't seem to think so. Okay, so b5, king e7, b6. I thought it would have been worth a try to at least here at least. Let's see. No, not that. I was wondering. Oh no, he can't take. No, he can't take. So, because if he takes, I just come out over there. It must be a little bit later. King f6, b5, king e7, e6. It must have been now. Hold on. What am I looking at? What did I see during the game? I don't know. Maybe I was just overthinking it. King e7, e6, king d7, king d4, king c6. Yeah, and king d4 was just, and you're about to see, is so I can allow my knight to block his bishop when he wants to attack over there on the king side. King c6, h6, king takes b6. Yeah, so the reason he just gave up on that pawn over there because this doesn't work anymore. That's why I moved king d4 so I can cover this square, so I can guard it when I put my knight there, which just stops him completely from guarding the h7 square. Oh, jeez. So yeah, I played king d4, so I use a knight to block that. Then my knight's home, my pawn's home free. So it looks like he saw that and just didn't even try, and then, I mean, it's game over from there. Yeah, h6, I think. h7, h7. Yeah, he just gave it. I got the queen, and then it was just a matter of checkmating with the queen and a knight from there.
What did you think about the tournament this weekend?
It was pretty competitive. There was only 16 players, but there's a lot of strong players. So the field was pretty strong.
What's the game we're going to look at today? Is that from?
Yeah, this is actually the last round. I was black, and it was my opponent started with e4. It was a French defense, and it's 2 knights variation. It's not the most common, but I see it every once in a while. So this is all pretty normal. And he took on c5, and I remember the move here. You instead of taking back immediately, you played knight c6. You're hitting this pawn twice. So he defends it with the bishop, then you take the pawn. So he plays bishop d3, and castling here, of course, immediately would be a big mistake because he has this sacrificing idea with the bishop, and then you castle, king takes, and the knight comes in with check, and the queen comes over. So played f6 here. The idea is to attack this pawn, and also it controls g5 square, so the knight's not coming in. If white takes, you take back with a knight, so if the knight's covering h7. So he didn't take, he castled, and I castled, and then he takes, so I take back with a knight, and yeah, he develops a queen to e2, putting more pressure on this e6 pawn. So I I dropped the bishop back to challenge his dark square bishop and trying to put more pressure on e5. See, he just moved the knight to e5. And I wanted to play queen c7 here, but I can't immediately because these guys, this knight move would be coming in here, hitting both these squares. So I played a6 to keep the knight out. And then he played a3, which not really sure why. I guess he wanted to keep my knight from coming in and attacking his bishop, but I think it was kind of an unnecessary move. So I went and played queen c7, and then he brings the rook over to give the knight another defender. And then I went for like a mass trade here on e5. I was just trying to simplify the position a little bit. This may not have been the best choice, but because everything ends up trading here on e5. So I played bishop d7 to connect the rooks and also control this a4 square, keep his knight from coming to a4 and coming to these two squares. So then he plays f3. Probably just trying to keep my knight from coming to g4 and his rook. So I dropped the knight back to e8 with the idea of bringing it to b6. So he doubles his rooks. And yeah, the possibility here of sacking the exchange, giving up the rook with a bishop and the pawn here, maybe getting the bishop and 2 pawns for a rook. I would have been up an exchange, but my center would be gone, so I didn't really want to allow that possibility, so I just moved the rook up to defend e6. So he puts the rook on h5, he's hitting h7 twice. So I play h6, and he goes knight d1, and his idea is he's trying to maneuver the knight around the g5 to attack my rook. So now I put my knight on d6, and his knight comes to f2. I move the other rook over to e8 just to give the e6 pawn another defender. And of course his knight comes to g4, so I drop the rook back. And then he brings his bishop in, hitting my other rook. So I move my rook to the open c file. He's got a lot of pieces around my king, but there's not really any sacrifices here. He just, there's not really much. White doesn't really have a lot right now. So he moves the rook back to e5. And so I played knight c4. I'm hitting his rook in this pawn here. So his rook has to move back. And I go ahead and grab the pawn, and it's not a free pawn because he has rook b1, hitting this pawn after my knight moves. But by taking this middle pawn, it destroys the structure on the queen side, just leaves him with 2 isolated pawns, which could be targets later. So he doesn't play rook b1 immediately, he plays knight e5, hitting my bishop. So I just drop my bishop back, e8 to challenge his bishop. And now he plays rook b1. So taking the bishop immediately would be a mistake because he would take back, and then he's threatening knight to come to e7, warping the king and this rook here, and my knight's still hanging. So pretty much have to move the knight, so I just move back to c4. And decide to take the knight, so now I take the bishop. And I'm hitting the c2 pawn twice after his knight moves. So he attacks my rook, so I take on c2 with the rook. Then he takes on e6, he's hitting my bishop. But I have this intermezzo move where I can actually take on g2 with check first, setting up a discovery on his rook on b1. And same thing as a minute ago on the other side of the board. I'm taking this middle pawn of a 3, and it is leaving all of his pawns are isolated. So he takes the rook, I take his rook. Then he grabs the pawn on b7. So now his rook's hitting my pawn on a6. So I just drop the bishop back to defend it. And then he attacks my bishop and the pawn. So I move the bishop again, then he takes. Then I have rook a8. So I'm hitting his knight, and then also his x-ray and his a pawn. So he has to move the knight. I just grab this pawn. So now it's in the end game, and I'm a pawn up, but it's not winning or anything because his pieces are still pretty active. Maybe the only thing is his 2 pawns are isolated, so they're a little easier to attack than mine are on the king side. So he attacks my d pawn twice, so I have to defend it. And he tries to move his king in. So I move my rook over to b5 to his knight, so his knight has to move. Then I go rook b2 check. Just x-raying that h pawn, so his king has to go back to the g file. And then I put the rook on e2. The idea is trying to keep his king out and then also controlling these 2 squares so his knight can't move in. And so he pushes the h pawn. So I move my king forward, and I still really can't move my king in because his rook and his knight are controlling all these squares. So he goes king f4. I put the rook on h2, hitting his h pawn, so his king has to go back. Then I go to a2. So his king goes back to f4. Now I go rook a4, and then now I'm threatening the discovery with that bishop, and also threatening that h pawn on the other side of the board. If I could ever win his h pawn, then I'll have 2 passed pawns, and then I'll have some threats. So he just moves his king forward. So I move the bishop to a2, still defending the d5 pawn and hitting his h pawn. So he goes rook d7, throws in this check, and really, my king just has to go back. If I go to g6, he'll just go knight d7. Then my king would have to move back to h7 probably. So he was really low on time here. Instead of that, he went for the rook trade. I think his idea was he wanted to trade rooks and then take the pawn with his knight. So I trade rooks, then I move my king in. So he moves his knight. He can't really play h5 here because then I would just play g6, and I'm eventually just going to get a passed pawn on the h file. So I just move my king towards his h pawn. He attacks the bishop. So let's drop the bishop back to c4. And then he takes here, and he gets the pawn, but it's the problem is his king's too far away now. So I just attack this pawn, and his king's too far away to defend it. So he pushes the f pawn, and I take the h pawn. He pushes again. And again, he was really low on time here, so he was just kind of under a lot of time pressure. So I dropped the king back to g5. He resigned here because there's no stopping this h pawn.
Yes, Stockfish says you have a 58-point lead.
yeah, pretty much just means it's game over.
Hi, I like to show you a game I played with Brian Rood from the Springfield Chess Club. Played this game in the 3rd round of the Springfield Open, and I think we got different routes to get there. I won one and lost one, and Brian had drawn, I think, both his first games, and we were on 1 out of 2, so we were both keen to do better. Now, Brian and I are both rated about 1830, and so because of that, we end up playing each other quite a bit in tournaments. So I knew he was going to play d4, and what I prepped was Queen's Indian with these moves. And Brian surprised me a bit with a3, which prevents kind of Bogo Indian idea, which I wasn't going to play anyway. I was going to play bishop to b7, and then after knight to f3 d5, like this. Now this is kind of interesting. Most Springfield players will, if you play d5 in these types of structures, they'll play c takes d, and that's what Brian did. Not a big surprise. Bishop g5 and then h6. Now, h6 is not as common because you can actually have this variation on the board. Takes, and check. So something like this actually doesn't work because the knight can take on d5. So this is the reason why h6 is not normally played, but I knew Brian wouldn't take it. He plays bishop to h4, and now this is another interesting point I wanted to show you is most people will play bishop to e7 here to break the pin, and that is the best move in the position. But I played bishop to d6 to try to activate this bishop. And once again, you have stuff like this. And this can be a good reason not to play bishop to d6, but you know, it's still a game. But the problem is after the trades, you're going to disrupt your pawn structure. So Brian played e3, and I got the king out of dodge just in time. And you can see this was a pretty well played game. There were, I think, center pawns were around 0.23 for me, and Brian was like 0.35, I think, the final analysis. Now I played c6 here. This is interesting because I've got a backward pawn on an open file, which generally is not a good idea. But because I had a strong bishop on b7, I was feeling good about that bishop. I thought that bishop was playing a good defensive role, and I wasn't really upset that I was like tanking the bishop because I thought that it would have chances in the end game to come back to life. So Brian castles, you get knight to d7 to b5. Now, I have a question. Pause the video here. What would you play? It's kind of interesting because I played a really interesting idea, and I had to go look it up after the game because I thought b5 here was really interesting because it allows my knight to get to c4. And once a knight gets to c4, it's staying there for forever, right? So this is actually what I played. I played b5 with the idea of knight to b6 and knight to c4. And this move here really defined the rest of the game. I figured he would, Brian would immediately see the c5 square and reroute a knight and put a rook on c1. But it's interesting. Watch this. So he immediately sends a knight on a route. Now this is the route that Brian is thinking about taking. Here, and here. That's what he calculated. Of course, I knew this, and that's the route that knight's. So this move, b5, basically sent the knight on a journey, and So the first thing I did was activate my rook to e1 and gain better control over the e4 pawn break that's always lurking in these positions. And Brian wants to get rid of his bishop and trade off my strong d6 bishop. So I sent my knight to the c4 square, and I also protected my bishop, so takes. And here comes that knight on that long journey across the board to c5. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit ahead of time, that damn knight never got to c5 because I took care of it. So my knight did make it to c4. Now, if he ever takes it, I'm going to get a protected passer, right? So it's kind of like a permanent knight there, and I was telling myself at this point that I'm never moving that knight no matter what. So get used to it being there. So Brian sends a knight to b3, headed to c5, and I play a move that I wanted to be active here and not. And so I played a5. a5 is a pretty interesting move because it actually drops a pawn, but I get a fairly active position out of it, and I activate my rooks. So I guess I played this first. Knight to d7, that's right. Opposing his knight. Queen c2, developing and controlling the open file, and then a5. So it's interesting because he does have bishop takes c4 here. Pawn takes c4, and then he picks up pawn up on a5 for free. However, his knight is forever stranded in that situation because I have a pawn on c4. So it's interesting. And let's just look at what happened. Interesting. Now, I looked at moving the bishop to these two squares to preserve it, but I ended up playing rook to b1 like this. And the idea was to activate my rooks. So I go from this situation to this situation with two rooks. And Brian brings a rook over to b1. So the activity of the rooks is pretty important here. Of course, he has a passed pawn on the a file. But I didn't think he could hold it because what happened in the game was I doubled up on the pawn, and now he's got one protector and I've got two attackers. Now he has two protectors and two attackers. My knight is coming to e4. Now this is a good move by Brian. Brian's really improved his play over the last year and puts a lot of effort into his chess. I think the Springfield chess players are 100 points underrated over maybe what the rest of the state is. And Brian's probably even another 100 points on top of that because he's improved a lot. He's had a lot of really good tournament performances. And I just like this move. It's, he's bringing his knight, which is not active, into the game. And trying to put pressure on me, despite the fact that I can hop my knight into e4 right away. And so he brings it back, and keeping two attackers or two protectors on this pawn, I think it's quite clear that the pawn, he's not going to be able to keep his a pawn in this situation. But he did bring that knight to e5, and I think that's just a great spot for his knight. Now, always attack at the bottom of a pawn chain. Well, where's the bottom of my pawn chain? It's here. So a lot of Brian's play over the next couple of games attempts to break this pawn chain down. So, I mean, good moves. He then kicks my knight. Of course, I'm actually, when I move my queen to f6, I'm actually threatening to take it with check. So f3 kicks the knight. Now, when I move the knight to the only square g5 here, I immediately saw h4, and h4 potentially is a real problem for me, because I thought my knight would have to come to h7, and then it's out of the game, and that might mean that I'm playing a piece down, and that could have some, you can lose a game like that. So my question is, h4, does it lose? And it turns out that if you do play it, you can actually still play knight d6, because you're going to drop this pawn like this. And you actually can play this. Isn't that neat? So it's pretty neat, because you're threatening a fork. So if you take here, and you've destroyed his pawn structure, and it's a playable move. So what might happen from here is maybe this, and you still can't take it because you get forked. So it's pretty neat. You can even do this. This is actually playable. So a lot of things could happen if you play knight to e6. Very interesting position, but that's not what happened. He ended up playing b5. Brian tries to destroy my pawn chain and activate his rook. It makes perfect sense, and that's what he does. Rook becomes more active. I bring my queen over. Now I have 3 attackers on the pawn. Brian blocks with the rook, so he's actually physically blocking me, and I bring my knight back like this to hit the rook, and you get this move. I thought queen to f8 was a maybe turning of the tides in this game. Before that, I felt like he had kept his opening advantage pretty well, but here, I thought that he's going to lose the pawn, and then I'm going to get some play. I've got a protected passer. Things are looking pretty good for me, and that's what happened. So the play went like this, and he moved here. Right here, I started calculating. Now, this might be a good place to pause the video and calculate yourself what you would play here. I think there's only one thing you can do is black, which is check, pin that queen. He comes down here. You take it. He takes your rook. Then you come up here. He comes down here and checks you. And the queen comes up to h7. This, both of us, I saw, and I'm sure he saw as well. What I didn't see, and I should have saw, was that after the check, he takes this pawn. So queen to d5. So all of this is forced, and that's what happened in the game. I don't know why I didn't see that. He could do that. I thought I was winning. So I checked him here, and he came back this way. Now, at this point, it had been a long game, and the clocks were, I think we were down to like 5 minutes or less. And this position here was my really only opportunity to win the game. But I think I was just mentally beat at this point. And I didn't even really look too much farther than just offering a draw, because the way the game ended was a bunch of this. But you can actually play check like this, and if he goes to repeat, check. If he goes here, check. You know, it gets tricky. Although black can lose this. If you, for instance, do this, then white is winning because white checks, forces a queen trade, and the white queen is in time to stop the black pawn. So this is actually, you know, with not much time on the clock, it was tough to calculate all this stuff. I'm sure if I had more time, of like, you know, 15 minutes, I could have easily worked all this stuff out, but I didn't really want to get into it. And like I say, my frame of mind was, I'm just happy to have equalized, and now I'm actually, you know, forcing the position here. So I ended up taking the draw, but it was good. Now the center pawn, I made no mistakes or blunders, just a few inaccuracies, and center pawns were 23 for me and 30 for Brian. So that's the game. My game 3 at the Springfield Open, and it was fun. And another draw for me and Brian. We have a lot of them, and that's it.